Hello, everybody. Today we are discussing COVID-19 and the virus that has caused it. This is obviously very relevant to today. There is a worldwide pandemic that has been brought about by the virus and the disease that it's caused, and it's just causing massive strain on every part of life. For every 7.5, almost 8 billion people that are on this planet today. And so I just wanted to put this video out. It is a strictly informative, strictly educational video that you don't have to have any medical or scientific background to understand. I'm trying to make this as fun and as concise as possible for everybody just to kind of understand what's going on with, COVID and if you contract it and what causes it and how your body actually fights it. So let's get started. So we should really describe what a coronavirus is. So when scientists first found coronaviruses, they looked at it under a microscope and they found that these little blue dots, these little blue stalks, if you will, these are actually the spike proteins. So you're looking at a computer-generated model of what the SARS-CoV-2 COVID-19 virus looks like. So this is what it actually looks like. Um, and these spike proteins, they looked like crowns when the scientists first discovered the coronavirus. And so they gave it the name coronavirus, which just means crowned virus, because they saw that there were these spike proteins on the top, and they thought, okay, well, it almost looks like there's a crown on top of this virus. So it's a very distinct shape that is only shared by these viruses. So any virus that comes from this family of viruses, they will be named coronavirus for that reason. So a lot of times these viruses, when we find a virus, we either find out that it is a DNA or an RNA virus. So this really just means, what does it use to replicate and make more viruses when it infects a cell? So the RNA viruses, they will use the RNA, which is often the blueprint, if you will, for making proteins. And that's the main way that it'll make the proteins that are necessary for its own virus maturation, and that's how it's going to, when it infects a cell, it hijacks that RNA machinery that we normally use for our own proteins. It'll infect that cell, use that machinery to make its own proteins, basically forcing the cell to do its bidding. And so there are many subtypes of coronaviruses. Most common are the low pathogenic variants such as those that cause the common cold, all the way to those that are the high pathogenic variants that we have now started to find since 2003 with the first coronavirus, which is the first SARS virus, excuse me, and then in 2006 and 7 with MERS, and now in 2019 and today we found it with SARS-CoV-2. So, as like I said before, what causes COVID-19 is really the virus that we've now officially called SARS-CoV-2. And the only reason it's called SARS-CoV-2 and not just SARS-1 or SARS is because it's the first, there was a first SARS that appeared in China in 2003. It was much more lethal, but much less infectious, which helped the contact tracer and the epidemiologists and the infectious disease doctors and doctors in general down in China to actually curtail it. So that's a big reason why this virus has been basically upgraded all the way to a pandemic and now has been wreaking havoc for the last 2 years. Because these viruses are RNA viruses and they are coronaviruses, they're known to replicate and mutate rapidly. Most often than not, those mutations really are meaningless. It's just, they make these RNA copies in mass, so there's obviously going to be a lot of errors within that, and because of those errors, that's where you get those mutations. But when we replicate things, we often have things that are going to look at what we've replicated and make sure that there is not an error within the transcript of the RNA. So just basically making sure that the blueprint has all the right schematics, making sure that we're not making any abnormal proteins. However, viruses don't care. They are just going to make in mass as much viruses as possible when it infects a cell. So there's really no checking of the RNA that they make or they translate with the host RNA machinery, and they just go in mass with this. So because of these mutations that they have, it has now jumped from human or from what we believe to be bats to humans because there was a consumption of bats and the close proximity to bats and humans has caused SARS-CoV-2. And now, because of these SARS-1, MERS, and SARS-2, There are now many coronaviruses that have been put on a high risk watch list for a possible jump from infecting only human or only animals like bats or pigs to potentially infecting humans and then thus causing human to human transmission, which then leads them to becoming an epidemic virus and then finally a pandemic. So the life cycle of a coronavirus, it's just you're going to get the virus from respiratory droplets. This is often going to come from exhalation if the person just breathes in and out. Sneezing, coughing, or they're obviously the big one. When you sneeze, there is a giant wave of basically just stuff that's coming from your lungs. If you're not, infected with a virus or bacteria, it's just kind of goo, basically. It's just mucus and, air. However, with the viruses, they'll actually hijack that and they'll kind of ride that little air and see if they can infect a new host. When they find a new host, they will actually take those spike proteins and they'll hit the receptors. So you've probably heard the ACE2 receptor, and there's just a ton of stuff in here that you really don't have to know. Just know that the virus will use those spike proteins to hit that receptor. Once it hits that receptor, it'll enter the cell, and when it enters the cell, it'll enter via this endosome. So this endosome is actually the correct way for the cell to ingest things. Normally, a cell wouldn't ingest a virus. However, viruses are very tricky, and they've learned through evolution to actually hit on these receptors and get ingested. So once they do that, they will hijack this RNA machinery, and when they do that, they will make these little baby viruses. And then the Golgi apparatus, which is responsible for basically just kind of putting the finishing touches on our normal, human proteins and making sure that those proteins are correct, it will just hijack that Golgi body, do whatever it wants, doesn't care if it corrects it or not, and then it'll make those mature viruses. So one virus may infect the cell, but hundreds of viruses will escape the cell. This usually causes the cell to actually die, and this is where the scarring and the lungs will come from, etc. So again, they make their way into the cytoplasm, which is right here. Because they are an RNA virus, they will be predominantly in the cytoplasm. DNA viruses like to locate themselves in the nucleus, hence why DNA is in the nucleus and why RNA is usually in the cytoplasm. The nucleus is walled off, so coronaviruses, this was another a myth that had to be debunked, but coronaviruses do not infect your cell's nucleus, so they don't alter your DNA in any sort of way. However, because of the life cycle of the RNA, we can actually find that there is um, the RNA from person to person. And because of that, we can actually notice where the virus is coming from. And so that's actually really outside the scope of this video, but you can actually, if you want to know, you can actually find out if a virus has come from a certain region. For example, like there was a strain that came from South Africa, and then there is also the Delta strain that is now wreaking havoc again with this. I think this is like the fourth or fifth wave with it. And I'm talking in an American sense, but of course there are issues in India, in Europe itself, and of course in South America. It's all over. It's all over, but more often than not, we can actually kind of figure out by the genus of the particular virus where it's actually coming from. So once that's all completed, the virus will escape, and then just goes on to basically infect more cells, and that's really just it's like a never-ending cycle, right? It's just like a loop basically. So the immune system will come in, and basically what you're seeing here, this big, giant, really scary looking blob, that's actually a really helpful guy. This is our T cell. So this is a photo of a T cell. Obviously, this is with a like really high-powered microscope. I believe this actually may be a computer-generated image of it, but you have we call them scanning electron microscopes. They are very high-powered and magnify to a very, very discrete area. So we got a really close-up image or a computer-generated model of this guy right here. So this is your T cell, and these are the big boys when it comes to viruses. There are obviously neutrophils, which are the big boys for your bacterial infections, but the big boys for a viral infection, the ones that will hunt down the virus and kill it very efficiently, are your cytotoxic T cells and your helper T cells that work in tandem, as well as your natural killer cells. Pretty fitting name for them, right? Like they're natural killer cells. And so these viruses will infect the cell, and the cell, by extension, will actually display this little basically like an SOS signal, like telling like any immune cell that comes around, like checking its ID, like, hey, I'm infected with something. I don't know what's going on. Can you please like remove this for, you know, the greater good of the body? So they will willingly tell an immune cell to kill them so that they will stop the infection. So the primary way of this is that macrophages, these are the cells that are their primary role is to just eat something, look at what they've ate, and then present that to a B cell and a T cell. And so what they do is they will check that tag, they find out that it's infected with COVID, and then they will commit that cell to apoptosis. And in the process, it ingests the materials and the viruses of that cell, and it will eat and destroy those viruses as best as it can. And again, that's outside the scope of how it does it, but it uses a variety of different killing methods. But what it will do is it'll find those proteins, particularly like the spike protein, like the most virulent proteins, and it'll present those to B cells. And it'll go around asking every B cell, hey, do you have an antibody to this? Hey, do you have an antibody to this? Hey, do you have an antibody to this? And once it finds that particular B cell that has the antibody, that B cell will start to divide rapidly to produce more copies of itself. And this is where your immune system will start to elevate its white blood cell count. So this is why a white blood cell count is elevated in a viral or a bacterial infection of any sorts, or even fungal infection. But most of the immune response, of course, is going to be the T cells and the natural killer cells, but they will work in tandem with the B cells that produce the antibodies that will hunt down that virus. And once the antibodies bind to it, they will actually activate like special proteins, like that we call complement, that will kill the virus itself, or the antibodies will just, the primary role for them is to mark this virus and inactivate it. So that's actually what the antibodies do, and they do it very effectively. The B cells, they are so cool. I think they're one of the coolest cells in the entire body, just because of the fact that they are like what I would consider the most not intelligent, but the most sophisticated in some sense when it comes to the immune system, because these guys, not only are they harboring a particular antibody, when they find it, they're just going to replicate like crazy. But then towards the end, they're going to start making what we call plasma cells. So as they undergo this cellular division, they produce more and more copies of itself, and it ends up at this last stage of replication, right? So they've replicated, made more of themselves, made more of themselves, made more of themselves, and in process, they've obviously produced a ton of these antibodies. But then they'll make what we call a plasma cell, and these are actually still B cells, but the reason we call them plasma cell is because these guys will lie dormant after an infection has been even cleared, and they will wait for the possibility of the virus to come in and reinfect the body. So this is how our immunity is actually built from the virus. So another way to get this is obviously through a vaccine. So if you were to give, for instance, if you were given a flu shot or the vaccine for COVID, you would get an immune response without the negative consequences of having the virus. But the primary thing is that we want you to build those immune systems, those antibodies, so that you can mount an immunity without actually having to get the virus. So the next time you have it, you already have a secondary immune response, so it's almost like an ambush against the virus when it first comes into your body. So again, every subsequent immune response just gets higher and better the more times you are infected with the virus. However, there is the possibility that you get so much viral load that this overwhelms and then ends up becoming an issue in and of itself, so that this like secondary immune response, which would otherwise be very good, is again overwhelmed, and then you get right back to like having a serious disease course, or you're immunocompromised. You can't make as many plasma cells, or you can't make plasma cells in general. There is an compromised disease state that patients can't make B cells, or their B cells just don't like to replicate. It's just very unfortunate disease with a high mortality rate. But for a normal individual, someone that has a normal state and hasn't been hit with a genetic aberration like that, they're going to have those B cells, and that's what causes our immunity. And if we talked about immunocompromised individuals, their immune systems weaken. By extension, those immune system responses, they're not as good. They're just not as efficient, and they may cause a much more serious infection with COVID. But that's not just with COVID. That's with any virus, bacteria, or fungal infection. Uh, the reason that happens is that the virus isn't cleared fast enough, and so the virus just keeps replicating and replicating and replicating and killing more cells and producing more of itself, and it's allowed to wreak havoc in the body for much longer. Oftentimes, it will come around and infect an individual for months instead of weeks, and it often, in the case of COVID, will cause the unfortunate death of the unfortunate passing of that individual. And of course, here is an X-ray and a chest CT of a patient that has COVID pneumonia. This is a viral pneumonia. Pneumonia can be brought about by a variety of different reasons, bacterial and viral being the big two. This is obviously a chest CT, this is a chest CT, and you're getting like a cross-section view, so it's almost as if you're looking at this person in half, and you can see both lobes of the lungs, or all three of the lobes of the lungs here, the two lobes here, and you can see these like patchy little infiltrates, and this is actually where the um, basically the breathing pathways, if you will, are being infected, and because that's where the virus comes into contact with, it'll kill off those cells and replicate more and more and cause this basically scarring and infiltrate, as we call it, in your lungs, and that's what causes what we call acute respiratory distress syndrome. So this is ARDS or ARDS for short, and this is a very serious turn. This is where the disease course goes haywire, and it often requires mechanical ventilation for the patient to receive adequate oxygen. ARDS in COVID-19 is again brought about by that viral pneumonia that develops in a serious bout with the virus. Patients are sedated, meaning that they're put under sedation with anesthetics and sedatives, and they're given medications to actually relax their muscles so as to not cause a spasm to the mechanical ventilator. And so that ventilator will breathe for them to get them the adequate oxygen that they need because the lung is either so scarred up or so filled up with fluid and gunk from the infection and the immune response and the inflammation that they cannot get enough oxygen no matter how hard they breathe. So when a patient is placed under mechanical ventilation, this is where you see a very drastic rise in mortality because this signals the highest level of medical intervention that we know to date that is needed for a severe disease course that you will have with a SARS-CoV-2 infection. However, that's not enough. As if our problems are not enough with having to get a giant tube down our throat to breathe for on our own, you may get a secondary infection. And again, we talked about this, if you're immunocompromised, this is like a pretty serious thing because this just can occur out of nowhere. Because your immune system just isn't as good. However, even if you're not immunocompromised, if your immune system has a normal status, and by normal, I don't mean to put down anyone that is immunocompromised. I just mean to say, like, that the immune system is acting the way it's supposed to and not acting against you, like an autoimmunity, or it's just not working right at all. Because SARS-CoV-2 is a lethal virus, and in anybody, it causes a pretty serious infection, or maybe you're asymptomatic. It does, with as is any virus or bacteria or fungi, will cause a basically a weakening of your immune system because imagine, your immune system is an army. It goes to war with this virus. It ends up on top. However, it might not end up on top for a while, meaning that there's a lot of your white blood cells that are being killed off. For example, like your T cells, your neutrophils, your macrophages example, right? And because of that, you are getting a lowered immune system response to other infections that may arise. So oftentimes, patients that are put under like mechanical ventilation, they're being introduced with pipes that are going, or like a tube that's going down their throat, and that can also often cause like bacteria. If it's, you try your best to make it sterile as a physician or any healthcare um, individual, but you can't stop every bacteria, and a lot of them are, you know, they are very adept at making sure that they're resistant to like the most common antibiotics that we have. So the one that we have pictured here, this little gram-negative rod right here, this is Pseudomonas. So Pseudomonas is like one of the biggest culprits for this. It is one of the first things that they will teach you in medical school when they start teaching you about bacteria and what to look for patients that have like pneumonia, for example. Pseudomonas is the one that's pictured here. Klebsiella pneumoniae is another big one for hospital pneumonia, acquired pneumonia, and mucor, which is a fungus that will literally eat your face. It eats away at your face and the front part of your brain, which is the frontal lobe, and it is a horrifying way to die. And it is one of the biggest ways. They call it the black mold, if you will. I don't really like that name because it just invokes a really strong imagery, but this has actually been seen and documented very well in India. With their rises in coronavirus cases, this was actually a large killer in part with COVID patients was the secondary infections. All in all, again, we're going back to the original picture of the coronavirus. I just wanted to make this video to be informative and just, kind of show what's going on with the virus and what's really causing it. And again, I hope that people did like this video. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe if you did like the content. And let me know down below what you think, what we should do next, any new ideas that you have for the channel. And if this is your first time ever watching my channel, watch my other videos. Maybe you're enjoying that content. Maybe you're an undergrad student that wants to go to med school. Maybe you're a medical student like me and you are in the thick of it. But all in all, I really appreciate everybody watching this video, and I hope to see you guys in the next one. Thank you so much.